Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. And we're just going to give it a few more moments just to let everybody else just join in, and then we shall start. Right. Okay. So, Emma, I'm just going to check in with you. Is there many more to admit, or shall we maybe start this off
You can
and just go
start
home?
because
Start? Yeah.
I
Okay.
can admit to
Add
my
people as
team.
I go.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, everybody, good morning to you, and thank you for joining us this morning. For some of you who may not know me on the list as they're coming in, my name is Colin Butler. I am Unitec Senior Technical Account Manager with a specialism in information security management. So today we're going to be doing our presentation on the NIS2 regulation, which is currently going through the European states at the moment, and obviously give everybody a good overview of, say, this directive, which is going to be coming on stream very, very shortly. So bear with. Okay. So hopefully in a second everyone can see the presentation here. What we're going to do is we'll take any questions at the end if that's okay. So feel free if you've got a question to let us know at the end of the presentation. And again, we can obviously arrange follow-ups, etc., with you guys afterwards if you so desire. So NIS2, hopefully a lot of you probably have started to hear the term that's coming on, etc. It's a European-wide cybersecurity law that is replacing the NIS1 regulation. Um, and the biggie is it's going to be strengthening across the critical sectors, the strengthening of cybersecurity and, as I say, the supply chains across the critical sectors. Now, a lot of people ask me what's a critical sector. We have a documentation we can share afterwards on exactly what that is. But as the base key points are, anybody that was allowed to work during COVID is a critical sector. So food, healthcare, manufacturing, etc., sort of thing, logistics, all those sort of industries are classed as critical sectors. So the aim of this is to harmonise across EU states, as say, that strengthening of laws. It's also as well to gather more information across the European Union about cyber instances and how we respond to them as well. So it's a very key note there. But the big element of the NIS2 regulation is it's going to add management accountability and mandatory reporting timelines for cyber incidents across the EU. So whereas maybe some people think that GDPR, as an example, is maybe an IT function and an IT responsibility, under NIS2, the responsibility comes back now to senior management, and enforcement is actually aimed at senior management level. So it's a very nuanced change in how that's going to be enforced from that point of view. So where we are as Ireland, well, we missed the deadline of October 2024. The National Cybersecurity Bill is how this is going to be implemented. The biggie is I was on a call last week with the National Cybersecurity Centre and Cyber Ireland, and they are suggesting that Ireland will be ratified for this legislation by the time we take over the EU presidency in the second half of the year. So we are expecting this to come onto the books very, very quickly, I say in the next few months. So I mentioned who must comply. So there are various industries that are going to be covered by this. And there's going to be classes of what they call essential or important based upon your industry sector and size. So it's everything from energy, transport, digital infrastructure, ITC suppliers like Unitec, healthcare providers, etc. And there'll be various caps as well on whether or not you apply. So there'll be financial base and also on staffing levels as well. And that staffing level is on total head count as well. It's not just on your IT counts, it's on total count of people. Some providers are automatically in the scope regardless of size. So anybody that is absolutely critical, no matter what base their size, they will be included in the scope of the extent of this. The biggie as well on that, just before we move on to the management duties, the fact is, I see a lot of companies that will fall under some of the requirements for this too, even though they could argue that their company is not in an industry where this is a requirement. One example would be you might be on a supply chain of a company that is under the requirement of this, and because they have to audit their supply chain, they would have to look at you as part of their supply chain delivering goods into them. So one example might be a clothing manufacturer wouldn't necessarily be classed as being part of NIS2, but a clothing manufacturer producing, say, PPE equipment into a healthcare provider may then be classed as under NIS2, because to keep that contract to a healthcare provider would mean the fact they would have to meet the requirements of that healthcare provider for their NIS2 requirements. So there is a lot of interest in that about how you maybe keep on supply chains, even though you may not necessarily are covered under the NIS2 requirements. Because if your supply chain says that you have to meet those requirements, then all of a sudden all those requirements for NIS2 starts to push downwards. So it's quite an interesting sort of time as we start to see some of the audits, etc. Now, I'd say management is the big change here. So rather than this under GDPR, where fines are a company fine, etc., under NIS2, the directive says that boards of management must oversee cybersecurity risk, approve frameworks, and receive training. Their failure to comply may result in high court action against the directors and fines and penalties to be levelled against the directors. So this is a huge change in the case there. So it's not where it's a company fine, it's now a director level fine. Management must also ensure evidence-based oversight and governance inside the business in the case of their cybersecurity. So I say it's not just an IT task, and this is one of the things that I've come across a lot talking to a lot of IT professionals, certainly over the last 6 to 9 months, is a lot of IT managers are being felt like it's being left for them to deal with all the implications of NIS2, etc., rather than it being part of the management of the company or the director level of the company, actually leading it with KPIs and leadership, etc. Because it's an effect to the actual director level of the company. If you like, IT can implement a lot of stuff and obviously deploy a lot of stuff, be it your managed service provider, your in-house IT teams, etc. But it does need to be driven by the actual director of the business, because there are going to be questions that are going to be asked along the way in terms of management of risk and understanding risk, etc. And that's probably beyond the scope of an IT manager. So security measures. Security measures basically involve risk analysis and security policy frameworks with continual updates. So constantly evaluating the risks that are out there, understanding the risks, and obviously devising different tools, etc., to mitigate those risks, etc. Instant detection and response procedures with logging and monitoring. So this is going to be very, very key. There's terms now and products out there where we refer to the term of SIEM, which is a security information management system, where everything that happens inside your organization goes into a central repository box, and then you're able to actually analyze the data in there and see any bad actors or any suspicious activity that's going on inside your network and root those bad actors out very, very quickly. Those tools become really critical because when we get to the reporting stage, we really do need to be able to show what happened and how we remediated and how we learnt those procedures going forward. Business continuity, disaster recovery, and crisis management plans and expectations are needed for every business. So this is everything from, what happens if an incident happens inside our business, who's responsible, who's our incident team, what's the recovery plan process, who the third parties are we bringing to help handle this incident from there. That goes beyond IT. So you have the IT element of it. Obviously, how do we get back up and running and we contain this incident, get the bad actors out, etc. But it may also include the insurance companies, the Gardays, PR, public relations, those type of things, to make sure that, as I say, we keep the flow of information quickly. You could also argue, depending upon the contracts you have with your customers as well, if somebody in your supply chain has an incident as well, and you now can't get the important product in to provide your service, where is the secondary stroke third options you have in your supply chain to keep your business running while that vendor's having an issue with their supply chain? So there's a lot in there in terms of keeping the wheels moving as well. Mentioned supply chain and vendor security controls. So we're starting to see a lot of customers are starting to get audit questionnaires from their supply chain to ask them, do they meet the requirements that are required for NIS2? So what levels of controls they have in place in terms of accessing cloud services, the security on the network, what security they have in terms of being able to detect bad actors, etc. Do they have frameworks such as ISO 27001 and change control processes to make sure the fact that they're actually auditing the supply chain? And those audits are going back to people that are making decisions about whether or not companies stay on the supply chain going forward, or whether or not they have to make an exemption for that person because they're so critical to supply chain, and then they're working with that vendor to try and help them increase their security across the board. One potentially good example is if you're working with a third party. I'm thinking of someone in maybe say the logistics industry where they outsource a lot of deliveries, etc., to other third parties. If that third party has really bad IT controls, then that data risk and that security risk from their point of view becomes your risk. It's part of your supply chain. Then if you're supplying into a really sensitive industry afterwards, then you have to manage that risk and understand, okay, do we still use that third party because it's really important to us? They might be a delivery company in an isolated part of the country. Or do we have to work them to get them up to spec, or do we have to change that third party vendor we're working with to bring them up to spec because it's important for our supply chain going forward from there? Mention things like MFA on those types of MFA multi-factor authentication is being asked about, access control, cryptography, security, secure system developments. So basically, really, what we're saying now is the fact is what the questionnaires are starting to come out about, and what the regulations are asking for is exactly how are you keeping my data safe in your organization and the data that we're sharing between our organizations, and I say making sure we bring a level of expectation across the board there. Now, as I mentioned, instant reporting is going to be huge under this too. So 24 hours for the early warning to notify the authorities, etc. 72 hours, let's say the severity, the indicators, the initial impact, and 1 month for a final report. Root causes, lessons learned, remediations, etc. The depth that you can provide your reporting in your lessons are obviously dependent upon the tools that you have in your organization. So again, the more tools and solutions that you have, you can provide this information a lot quicker. And then again, there is also now starting to become an onus upon actually playing out the scenarios, doing desktop exercises with your important people and your suppliers to basically see how these things would actually stack up in the event that something happens. They're quite interesting sessions, seeing senior management around a table, top exercise, being asked the honest questions. Okay, this has happened. What are you going to do next? The ransomware people have asked for €1 million. Who has the authority around the table to actually make that decision if we have to pay the ransomware people that sort of money? Who's the ethical hacker we might bring in that does a negotiation with these people to maybe see if we can bring that figure down if we need to use them, while we're still deciding if we actually can bring back the data from our safe backup locations and whatever it be, and how are we going to make that decision in terms of obviously making sure that everything comes back online. So these desktop exercises start to open up and expose different ideas inside the business in terms of, as I say, how we respond when this happens. And when you look at the timelines involved at this 24 and 72-hour area, having those people trained and understanding what might happen in the event that this would happen to a business. And in the day, it is always an example of when, not if. It means the fact that your senior management people are ready to act and have gone through a couple of scenarios, so they're ready to thinking about the right things as those things happen. So the horrible enforcement part, as I mentioned, the big is director level. So fines are up to €10 million or 2% of turnover for essential, and 7 million and 1.4% for important entities. It's important as well that that's on top of any GDPR fine as well. So GDPR, we always mention about 10 million 2% and 20 million 4% for the vulnerability stuff there as well. So it's a secondary level on top of it. Evidence of things like asset inventory, vulnerability management, login, training records, etc. are going to be expected for them to see, I suppose, in essence, the gap. So with all these type of legislations we saw with GDPR, it's the gap between the near on perfect conformity and where you are as a business that is the definable part in the middle. So again, the more evidence you can bring to show we trained staff, we assessed risk, we did all these sort of things, this etc. sort of thing, helps to try and close that gap as much as possible to reduce the fines. But again, obviously, if you don't do those things as a business, then the bigger the gap is, the bigger the fine when they come along from there. And again, poor reporting or repeated issues, and again, will be picked up from there. One of the other things that can be interesting as well from that enforcement point of view and that reporting point of view is that in the fact that an incident happens in your supply chain, unlike GDPR, where the instance is on the business that has the impact on them, under NIS2, the whole supply chain has to report. So what that means is you have to obviously go to your supply chain and say, we've had an incident. And then what happens is they all have to report to their individual government departments. So for instance, Unitec would have to report to Comreg, someone in the healthcare industry would have to report to the Department of Health, etc., from there sort of thing. And basically we all have to report because the supply chain has been affected. Now, obviously, the part of the supply chain which has the instance, or obviously, you'd obviously be the one that has the bigger, deeper reporting side of thing. But the individual parts of the supply chain still have to report and say, okay, we've been investigated, it's not affected us, etc., sort of thing, and our part of the supply chain is clean as it goes from there. So it's such a big change from GDPR, where it was just on the owners of the business that had the issue that has to report. Now the whole supply chain has to report going forward. Okay, so impact on Irish business. Significant increase in scope in the organisations, digital providers, etc. The due diligence we need to do to make sure we're aligned, our procedures and our suppliers are massive. So say surveys, if you haven't seen them already, surveys are going out. I've seen a lot in manufacturing, in pharmaceutical and in the food industry already, where they're asking all these relevant questions, if you like, what security standards do you have in place, etc., and you're being scored upon those things. There is also there's been talks about the Microsoft security score, which you'll have as part of your Microsoft 365 tenant, being used as some of this scoring process. Now, unfortunately, it's the only score at the moment which is very arbitrary across most businesses. So a lot of people are using that as an example of how secure you are, but it doesn't really probably represent a full picture of security. It's just the only measure there is. What we expect to see announced in the bill when we pass is something very similar to the UK Cyber Fundamentals scheme, where it's a certifiable scheme, a bit like an NCT on your car, where you can actually certify your whole business and its security level in your business, which would be more of a tangible sort of overview of everything in your business rather than just the Microsoft security area, if you like. So we are seeing things on those lines that we expect to see come on board. Compliance will be a competitive differentiating bid. So as I mentioned, well, these surveys will come out. We're starting to see them as well on tenders. We're helping clients fill in where it is actually asking about the security of the data. Where is it? What the controls are? What the policies are on that bit from there. And again, they're being scored for winning the tenders based upon those areas. Public sector supply chains is saying, again, this is going to be big. So I was working with a colleague's client of mine last week, and again, we had this similar type of question came up. Well, we're only a very tiny client. We only do a certain things for the county council. Why would they ask us to comply? Well, because you're part of their supply chain, and they've obviously got to conform to, the government standards going forward. So again, that was a very important part of that conversation last week, where, let's say, the client now has to make a decision about the security they put in place for this legislation to make sure they stay on that county council supply chain going forward. Now, again, let's be very honest. If it's a very, very tiny sliver of your business and the tools to put in place to meet those requirements is a cost-benefit analysis, you might make the decision that the risk is to actually leave the supply chain and rather than put those security controls in place. But for most companies, it's a large chunk of their business, and of course, they would want to keep that business flowing. So they would want to keep that place for now. So, from a readiness point of view, determine the scope you're in, and not only what you're in, but also where you are in someone else's supply chain is probably important to assess as well. Gap analysis in relation to things like where the National Cybersecurity Centre come in. There's also, say, if say Unitec customers can use their Unitec account manager, etc., to assess where they potentially are in terms of, say, their data, etc. Engage your board. This one's massive. We work with a lot of, shall we say, middle managers in an organisation as the IT contact. And as I say, it really is important that those companies embrace their senior management in this conversation and work out where they are in terms of their processes, where it lines with the business needs, their reporting and the training, etc. That needs to be done. As I say, senior managers do need to get a handle on this one to know the fact that they are now going to be responsible. Real world drills, and again, can you meet these deadline timelines? What does it look like to have to report in 24 and 72 hours? Can we get everyone together? Have we done a desktop exercise? What would a desktop exercise look like in our organisation? There's lots of ways of running them. As I say, you can work with your IT vendor. You can work with some insurance companies do these, etc. sort of thing. And it's a really interesting exercise just to go through your disaster recovery plan and make sure everybody understands they're part of this role to make sure they can meet those requirements. Because a 24-hour reporting process is actually, quite an impact when you're going through something like this. There's probably a lot of other things that are going on in your head and not necessarily thinking about, oh my God, I've got to report in 24 hours. So again, working from there. And then in essence, part of your pack of evidence and your DR plans, etc., your asset logs, your supplier controls, etc. Have you surveyed your client, your vendor list, and made sure that everybody complies to the standards that you want them to comply to as part of this supply chain? And on that basis as well, how often do you test that? And then the secondary part is if then your suppliers then have a problem coming into you and they do an obviously report, they have an incident, they have a cyber incident, etc. What is the method of control you're going to use to make sure that either A, they remedy it in terms of actually, improving the security basis, or B, what is the number of instances, etc., that you might allow them to have before you actually maybe say, I'm terribly sorry, you now need to be removed from our supply chain. So, because again, there are risks to you in that reporting elements as well. So again, very important in terms of understanding that risk as you go from there. So I mentioned really some target data, some targets really is to be audit ready. I'd go for there. Say things like the disaster recovery plans are very, very important as well. seeing the supply securities and evidence and flows from there, making sure senior management involved in those as well, the risk of certain companies if they fail, your levels and what you might do about them, and understanding that risk, etc., is very, very important. And then obviously continuing improvements, instant metrics, etc., peer groups, taking on board all the information that's out there at the moment, the changes in the type of attacks and what's happening to businesses out there are becoming extremely varied at the moment. So it really is very, very important that we continue to evolve the security controls we have and making sure that everything's in place, making sure our staff are updated in terms of the human element of it, putting all the controls in place to take away as much of the decision making they have to do across the board. And again, having those informations all reported. Right, so from our point of view, obviously, we're available, obviously, to talk to anyone. So, obviously, if anyone's a Unitec account manager on the call, reach out to your Unitec account manager for more information. Anyone who's not a Unitec customer already, we're more than willing to have a chat to you about this from there. And also very willing to take any questions if anybody has any questions today. So this is the bit where I've stunned everybody into silence. They're going, "Oh my God, have I really got to do this in a few months?" No. Okay, just to check, guys, just to say, if anyone wants to raise a hand or drop a Q&A in there, where would you start with this? So Cormac asked, where would you start with this process? Good question, Cormac. Um, in essence, I would, depending upon where you are in your business, Cormac, are you management or IT on that side of things? I suppose, in essence, if I was coming at it from an IT point of view, I'd be looking at things like my perimeter security, things like the firewall, etc., and is it up to date in terms of its security. I'd be looking at my automation tools, things like what they call the SIEM, the Information Security Management, and the Managed SOC solutions in terms of being able to track all of that type of data my users are using, etc. And then what that does is it suppresses down all the good traffic. It suppresses down all the good traffic and it lets you analyze just the bad traffic on top to get the bad actors out quickly, if you like, before they create an incident. If you were looking from a management point of view, you probably would start off with things like the disaster recovery plan point of view and the business continuity plan point of view. So what happens in the event that this happens or that happens, etc. type of thing. And then you sort of come down into then the risk stuff, which would bring you back into that SIEM and SOC conversation in terms of how are we actually monitoring the devices and the stuff on our network, etc., to go from there. And then I suppose in essence, maybe to sound like a sales director needs to maybe start getting involved in terms of, or sales or the production director might need to get involved in terms of the auditing of their supply chain and understanding, if you like, how that goes from there. So in terms of you just send out just as general survey, I've seen them sent out with Microsoft Forms. I've seen them sent out on paper and whatever it be. Well, they just ask some very, very simple questions. Do you have MFA on your accessing your cloud services? Do you have ISO 27001? Do you have a change control system? How do you manage data in these environments, etc.? So that
Can
would
I
sort of
ask?
go from
Can
there.
I ask? Sorry, can I
Mm.
ask as well? How far down the supply chain, does this go? Like, as a construction company, we'd have a lot of guys who IT is the last thing on their mind, not being
Mm.
smart. Like, if
Yeah.
you're talking about guys, plasters, or like, how far down the supply chain does this thing have to go? And
So in essence, I suppose you could argue it has to go all the way down the supply chain. But then see your plaster, if you take a plasterer, like a single one-man band plasterer, then your requirement on them might only be, let's just say, do you have MFA on your email? Is your email properly managed, etc. If you're receiving invoices from them, or you'll send them jobs electronically, etc. But then see if, but with that same plasterer, if you're only sending them jobs by paper, for want of a better term. They just turn up. You make a phone call and say, can you turn up to XYZ site and you're going to be plastering today, and they give you a paper invoice at the end of it. Then in essence, you could argue from your risk analysis, well, there's no cybersecurity impact upon that because
The reality is all these
you're
people
not,
are going to have emails, and they're all going to have invoices going over and back, because that's the way business is done now. But like,
yeah.
like the cost of putting this in place for smaller businesses, is that going to start putting, like, if this is a requirement, is this going to start putting them out of business, not being smart?
Probably not, because I suppose your requirement for them on the risk analysis would be, can you send secure emails? If I send you a piece of data into your email and you're going to send me back a piece of data on email, can we make sure that email exchange is secure? And in some respects, you might argue for that type of business, for that type of value, etc., in your risk analysis, that all they would need to deploy on their email is multi-factor authentication. Now, that is relatively low cost, if any at all, sort of thing. So in essence, for that type of person, you would argue that they just need to comply and make sure that their email is secure, so no one else can get in that email and do the man-in-the-middle attack that we would call from there. And then when you're going through your list of suppliers, if you like, you would say for this type of person, they get a minimal amount of information. It's probably an invoice. They're probably getting a few text lines of what a job is, and they're sending me back an invoice. And as long as we make sure that email communication is secure, then in essence, I've certified off my my piece from there. However, if you're sending them large scopes of information and documentation and blah blah blah, the rest of it from there, then obviously then the risk to the supply chain grows, and then you might have to then think about how maybe we exchange information with that person as you go from there. But in essence, well, someone like a plaster in that case scenario, and you're just saying go to this site and plaster these walls for me, and they send you back a bill saying, can you please pay my invoice? Then MFA on the email might be all you need to put in place from that point of view, because they're very, very low risk down the chain. Whereas if you would turn around and say,
But typically,
and
what
again,
you
just
do is you send them, you say maybe a bill of quantities and the drawings for the job, and get them to price it up.
yeah, and again, you could argue, but there's very limited data as such in that sort of thing. It's very generic data. It's such sort of thing. So it's about doing a risk analysis on that, is the honest truth answer, and saying, look, do you have those things? And again, same thing. If you're sending that inside, say, a Microsoft 365 account as a OneDrive share, MFA on those accounts, and him confirming he's got MFA on those accounts and putting those levels of controls in the account may be enough in there. It might be a case of, from your point of view, Cormac, you might turn around and say, in our 365 environment, we will tag this area where we put the plasterers' drawings, etc., in there, where they can't be downloaded to a local machine. So we contain those inside the web browser. So they can't be downloaded, etc., sort of thing. But the guy then knows he can view them on his machine, whatever it be, with his security code, and then go from there. So there's some controls you could put in place from your end to make sure obviously you contain the data. But in essence, it's just about managing that risk, and that's what it's about. It's about managing risk. But I wouldn't say it would be knock out like your single sole trader. But you might have to say to single sole trader, the least you've got to do is make sure your email's secure.
And are you saying if he has a cyber security breach, that we have to report it as well as him?
Yes, because he's part of your supply chain.
And what about if we don't know about it?
Then
What if
you don't,
Thomas?
yeah, okay. So obviously you can the legislation will be on him to report it to his supply chain. Obviously, if you don't know about it, you can't do anything about it. But obviously, the correct answer is that he should be telling his whole supply chain, I've had an incident, and then everyone goes. Now, from your point of view, you can turn around and say it hasn't affected us, so no foul on our end, and you carry on, sort of thing. And obviously, the recommendation from your point of view would be to say, go back to the plasterer and say, you must put MFA on your email now. Come on, you've got to do it, because this is what happens when you don't do this stuff.
Okay, thanks.
So that's where it goes on from there, sort of thing. Okay. If we are only in scope as a supply chain member, do we have to check audit our supply chain? Potentially, Orla, potentially. And it goes down to the fact is it will go down to really, I suppose, what your supply chain puts on you. So I did have a conversation with a food manufacturer recently who pretty much were being put under control, that the what was coming from the big supermarket down to them was that they had to make sure they had all this availability of stuff, etc., coming through, so that they would then have to probably pass on those same requirements to their supply chain. So, going from there, or do they look at putting a secondary level in? So if you had a piece of packaging that you needed to finish off your product, that person could argue, well, I don't need to necessarily be on the NIS2 compliance, but you might need to, because of your contract obligations with the supermarket, for an example. You might need to put a secondary level in as a supplier to say, first has a problem, then I can go to secondary, so it doesn't breach my contract relationship with that supplier from there, if that makes sense. And that's where the business continuity part of the plan kicks into play. Is like, if there's a problem in manufacturing because we can't get hold of this part for whatever reason, even though that part disqualifies, or we've decided it's not part of there, but it affects our business in terms of our business continuity, where is the plan to get around that if that happens? If that helps on there. I assume this does not apply to our UK suppliers. Suppliers in the UK, is that equivalent? Yes, the UK ratified, Laura, quicker, their version of this too. I can't remember the name off the top of my head, and I know I should. And this is where a term called Cyber Essentials has come from. So Cyber Essentials and Cyber Foundation, sorry, is a UK plan for the way they certify businesses to make sure they meet the requirements of this type of legislation. It's not called NIS2 in the UK, and I'm struggling to remember the name of it off the top of my head. I apologise, Laura, it's just escaped me, but they have an equivalency in the UK. So yeah, I think it might even be something like Cyber Essentials or something they call it, sort of thing, and Cyber Fundamentals is the the certified bit on top of it. So there is an equivalency across that way, if that helps. Can you provide notes on this regarding Microsoft certification mentioned earlier? Okay. Yeah, so on the Microsoft certification, it's something called Microsoft Security Score. It's in your tenant, that we can look at from there for you. It's not equivalency to ISO 27001. 27001 is an information security management system, that you would go from there. I think that might answer your question there, but I'll give you a buzz afterwards, and I will come back to you a bit more on that one, just to understand that question there. Will, thank you. Cybersecurity and resiliency, Bill, thank you. As an IT department with a business with third-party IT partners who are NIS2 certified, does that mean that we, as an internal IT department, hence business, are covered under NIS2? No. So what you will find with surveys is, if your IT partner has, I'd say ISO 27001, which a lot of them will have, which is technically the bit that will make them NIS2 certified. You can, on things like vendor surveys, say we work with a partner who are NIS2 certified, etc., sort of thing, and you can, in essence, lean on that certification. But it does mean, as much as you lean on certification, you still need to have the tools and the reporting processes, etc., in place for the legislation. And it also means that you still need to potentially have your own disaster recovery solution and business continuity solutions in place for your business. So an example is, as an IT vendor, when we go into the unfortunate bit of disaster recovery and the cybersecurity stuff, our main goal when we go into those environments is to get your business up and running as fast as we possibly can. And that's usually a good thing. However, if you have cyber insurance, or you are a semi-state body, or with Gardaí involved, etc., there might be other requirements during that recovery process that an IT vendor wouldn't know, and that's where your own business continuity process comes into play. So we've seen one recently where we had production was desperately running, trying to get production up and running as fast as possible. The guards wanted everything shut down for weeks because they wanted to do an investigation and try and catch them through Interpol. We also had an insurance company involved that were asking the question, is it cheaper for us to pay the bad actors off and hope they don't publicise the data that's been breached so we don't have to report it, rather than go through this whole process? And everybody was pulling against each other. But the problem was the business didn't have a plan in the middle that was tested to make sure the fact that the business actually responded the way the business wanted to respond. So everybody responds differently in those scenarios. But in essence, that's where the business continuity disaster plans come into play, because then you can pull those out when you need to and ask those relevant questions to the business at that time. And there's nothing worse than when these things happen and everybody's running around desperately trying to get the place up and running if there's not a centralized plan to actually bring the business back up. Any other questions? No, maybe not. No. Okay, so I know Emma's going to make this available online for anybody that wishes to go back and have a look at it. As I mentioned as well, if you're not a Unitec customer, please reach out to us. We're more than happy to have a conversation with you regarding and say all this stuff and what's involved, etc. for now. If you are a Unitec customer, please reach out to your Unitec account manager, who'll be happy to have conversations with you. If you're not one of mine, and you wish to sit down with have a cup of coffee myself, I'm more than willing to come along with your account manager and have that cup of coffee. So please let us know from there. Oh, sorry, I found some more here. My apologies. In the case of a small service business, does Unitec provide a service of reviewing your risks and provide solutions? Yes, Derek, we certainly can provide services of reviewing the risk and providing solutions. That is something we certainly can do. It's a combination of a few things coming together, but in essence, yes, we can do that for you. So we can certainly reach out to you after this call and arrange that for you if you certainly wish. So yeah, no, as I mentioned, as I say, we'll publish this online for you, so you can check this out later on. And as I say, hopefully, as I say, it's answered your questions later on this too, and we're more than willing to have more conversations with you going forward over the next few months as this picks up from there. So yeah, so Emma, if you can maybe let guys know when we might be able to find this from there, that'd be great.
Yeah. Did you see the last message there as well? When does the direction come operative?
Yeah, so we're expecting this to come into play by the Irish presidency, which I believe will be H2 this year. So that's when we're expecting it to come into play. Okay, in H2. So yeah, that's when we are expecting this to come into play. And that was based upon a call I was on last week with the National Cyber Security Centre. This is in line with the National Cyber Security Centre conversation yesterday, also with Cyber Ireland. So they expect that from there. Will you expand on online training in this area similar to what you already provide for data security? Yeah, we will continue to, Catherine, yeah, we'll continue to advise as much information as we can in relation to this area. The biggie will be, Catherine, and I'll touch base after, as I know you, Catherine. The biggie on this is to continue to deploy the tools and the solutions required to help protect the business. So that would be the biggie from there. So I'll touch base with you afterwards, Catherine, on that one, and we can go through that a little bit more in depth for you. So that's not a problem at all. Cool. Any more? I think there's some more going on in chat. Is there? Okay, Miss Start saying, when does director come? Sorry, Derek, I've mentioned that there for you, so we've got it there for you. Thank you, John. And yeah, so we'll pop that on YouTube for you. So thanks to everybody for joining us today. Really do appreciate it. Hopefully it's, I say, a quick overview that's enlightening for you. There's a bit of work involved in it, but as I say, we're here to give everyone a hand, so that's no problems at all for you. So yeah, thanks a lot for joining us today, guys. Thank you. Have a great day.